Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel. So this video today is going to be about anxiety and fear type symptoms and some coping skills to get you through those. So before I get into the video, I just wanted to mention that I am offering one-on-one coaching for those who need it. I'm offering it at lower rates than you might find elsewhere online. I have a free 15-minute consultation, 30-minute calls, 60-minute calls, and then I've put together some session packages for those who might want to meet a little bit more regularly, and that's at a further discounted rate. I will put the link to my online booking calendar in the description of this video. I will also put the link to my website if you're interested in checking out a bit more about my story. If you're unfamiliar with it, you can also book sessions through my website. I will also leave my email address in the description box. If you just have a single question you want to ask me, feel free to email me. I just ask that you limit it to one question, as I'm not having time anymore to answer lengthy emails. So on to the video. I just wanted to make one about anxiety and fear symptoms and how to cope. So first of all, I'm not implying in any way or implying in no way that what you're going through is anxiety. I know that that's what people often get gaslit about, or that's what they get told by potentially well-meaning health professionals and doctors and family members and friends who just don't understand what psychiatric drug withdrawal is all about. And they'll tell you, oh, it's just anxiety. You need therapy. You need this, that, and the other thing. You need medication. You need SSRIs. You need benzos, whatever it may be. And so I'm not implying that at all, but definitely most people who are going through psychiatric drug withdrawal experience fear and anxiety symptoms on steroids times 1,000. And so for those people who may have had anxiety symptoms prior to the drugs, I've found that some people have developed coping skills along the way that they had before the drugs that maybe will help them a little bit when they're in withdrawal, and other people had no prior experience with anxiety whatsoever, and so it's all foreign to them. And I'm also finding that a lot of the people that I talk to weren't even prescribed psychiatric drugs for psychiatric symptoms. So many people were put on them for, menopause or PMDD or insomnia or back pain, or there's a whole list of symptoms that have nothing to do with mental illness whatsoever. And then these people are taking these drugs, having adverse reactions and or going through severe withdrawal from them, and are developing all of these psychiatric symptoms that they've never had before and don't know how to cope with. So bear in mind that I do realize that what you go through from these drugs is definitely not fully controllable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this situation. But I do feel like, and I've talked about this in other videos, there's a lot of second fear, especially if you've spent a lot of time on forums or researching this syndrome, and you go down all those rabbit holes and it just creates more fear. I feel like at a conscious level, if you can have some coping skills for anxiety and fear symptoms, it can dial down that second fear and just help you to cope more while you're going through the recovery process. So here's some things. I have a prior history of anxiety. It was nothing like it was when I went through drug withdrawal, but I did have a lot of anxiety coping skills before I ever took psychiatric drugs. I took them for situational depression when I got laid off from my job, totally unnecessary, and I was irresponsibly prescribed them. But my previous coping skills did come in handy and were somewhat helpful when I was going through the recovery process. So I just made a list on my phone here of some things that I know to be somewhat helpful. Maybe they'll help you, maybe they won't, but I feel like it's important to list these because I know a lot of people really struggle with the fear and anxiety. So I read this book when I was in my early 20s, when I was struggling with my first sort of serious bout of anxiety, panic attacks, and intrusive thoughts. Again, it was nowhere near what it was after the drugs, but it was a spike in symptoms, and it was a real kind of introduction to intrusive thoughts and some pretty serious panic symptoms. And so my mom gifted me this book called From Panic to Power by Lucinda Bassett. It's kind of outdated now. It was written in 1995. I think it's been revised a few times, but that book was really life-changing for me with my anxiety symptoms back when, I had panic attacks that would cause me to collapse. They were so bad prior to the drugs. And this first sort of spike or bout of this happened for me in 2004 when I was 22. And after I read this book and implemented the skills, I would say conquered the majority of my anxiety for years. And then when I started SSRIs in 2011, so 7 years later, I didn't really have anxious symptoms anymore. Like I said, I took the drugs for a situational depression from job loss. So one thing that was mentioned in that book was, and this might sound crazy to people, but she talks about how anxiety and excitement really have a lot of the same symptoms. It's how we're interpreting the symptoms that basically determines whether or not it's an anxious response or an excitement response. And at first I was like, what does that even mean? And so she gave this example of how she was at the top of a ski hill once, and it was, I don't know if she had been an avid skier or a beginner, I can't remember, but she was feeling just petrified when she was at the top of the ski hill, and she felt, her heart was palpitating, her heart was racing, she was sweating, she was having all these scary thoughts like, what if? And she had met this really boisterous woman, I guess, on the ski hill who, she was saying, I'm really afraid, like the author of the book was saying, I'm really afraid to go down this ski hill, like I'm having all these symptoms. And this boisterous woman, I remember that's how she described her, said, I have all those symptoms too, but I'm just excited. And so this was kind of a light bulb moment for her, and she realized that a lot of the symptoms you get when you're excited are similar to what you get when you're anxious. It's a stimulated nervous system response. It's just how your mind is interpreting those symptoms that judges, I guess, where you end up. If you end up in a panic attack, or if you end up calming your system down because you're interpreting it as a good thing. So I thought that was interesting. And back when I had my initial anxious episode, I started doing this, and I did find it helpful. Because I was like, this is really interesting that I can not fear the symptoms. I can judge them as excitement. Even if I don't have anything to be excited about, I could tell myself, okay, this is what I feel when I'm excited, but those times don't scare me even though I have the same symptoms. So that was another thing. There was another book I read called When Panic Attacks by, I believe it was David Burns, who is I think he's a psychiatrist. It's been a while since I read his book. Or he's a psychologist. He has an advanced degree in something. And he talked about, the whole book was cognitive behavioral therapy based, and it's focused on all different branches of anxiety. So he has like OCD and phobias and PTSD and all of these different kind of sections. And in it, there's kind of a workbook involved, or workbook sections in the book that were helpful, because that's typically what you would do in a therapy session, is you rank your symptoms and do homework and stuff like that. So I found that part of the book helpful if you're interested in checking it out. He always talks about going to the end. So I hear this a lot of times with people, and my fear, even before the drugs, was I had this fear of fainting in public. I know some people have fears of vomiting, and they have fears of having a panic attack, and they have fears of dying, and they have all these different fears. My fear was fainting. For some reason, I had this tremendous fear of passing out in public, and I don't know where that came from. And so this book teaches you, okay, go to the end with that. So what is your worst fear if you faint? Okay, or your worst fear. So I would say in my mind, or write down in my workbook, my fear is fainting in public. Okay, well, what would happen if you fainted in public? Well, I would look stupid, or what if nobody was around to save me, or whatever. And you just continue to go all the way to the end, and then you sort of work backwards. Like, there's this whole process to it. It's really interesting, and it gets you, because in your mind you sort of get blocked at that fear. You just think, oh my God, like what if I faint in public? That would just be the worst thing. But you're not really figuring out why you have that fear, or what would happen if that fear happened. What's the worst thing, And so I found that very helpful. And then as you work through it, he teaches you how to work through that, and you use a rating system, and I found it helpful. So check out his book if you're interested. I know a lot of people in this drug community talk about the DARE program, or the DARE app. I forget who wrote that book. I did read it a long time ago. It was good too. It was similar to what I'm talking about here, so check that out as well. And Claire Weeks is another one that is, I know her stuff is quite outdated, but it's still pretty relevant, and she talks a lot about second fear. I think that's where I get that term from, is Claire Weeks. I can't quite remember, but she's another one who wrote a lot of books on anxiety and fear symptoms that can be helpful for people in withdrawal. So another thing that helped me was to understand anxiety, because when I first started going through it prior to the drugs, I didn't know what was wrong with me. I just remember feeling scared all the time, and I didn't know there was something called anxiety disorder. I didn't know that was even a thing. I just knew that I felt scared way more than I should, and way more than most people. And I was afraid of things that had never happened, things that were really unlikely, and I didn't understand where it came from. And now I realize you don't have to necessarily understand where it comes from, but just to understand anxiety in itself. So I always had this fear of fainting. And so once I learned that the chances of you passing out from fear, I did collapse a couple of times from panic attacks, but I was afraid of like going unconscious and hitting my head and all of those things. And once I understood that anxiety very, very, very rarely involves fainting, that helped me to a degree to understand. And once I understood the physiological process, well, typically people's blood pressure goes up when they're anxious, and fainting is often from a drop in blood pressure. And it talked about all of the physiological processes that go into anxiety and panic, and how the likelihood of that resulting in fainting was like nil. So once I understood what was happening in my body during anxiety and what can and can't happen, same with people who fear a heart attack. I mean, your chances of having a heart attack during an acute panic attack are not very high. And then, make sure you have your heart checked out and that your heart is healthy, obviously, and see your doctor regularly for checkups. But once that's ruled out, I mean, your chances of having a heart attack just based on, having a panic attack are pretty much zero. So just like learning more about the physiology of anxiety can be helpful. At least it was for me. So there was another thing that helped me. I started reframing my anxiety. So again, I'll use the example of the fainting because that's something that is really concrete in my mind that I used to be afraid of. And so I was like, okay, well, what's a good thing that could come out of me fainting? And I had a fear of fainting in public, specifically at work, because I had a public job back then. And I was like, oh, well, if I fainted, I could probably go home for the day. And I started reframing it into what's something positive that could come out of me fainting. Oh, maybe, someone will help me and then I'll become friends with them. Or I don't know. I just was trying to reframe it in that way. And the one that helped me the most was, oh, I could probably go home for the day and just chill out and watch movies or whatever. If I do pass out, I'm sure my boss will send me home. So just like simple things like that, reframing was a big part of getting through and coping and really overcoming my anxiety. Another thing is I would have intrusive thoughts. So obviously they were on steroids. Once I went through drug withdrawal, they were absolutely chemical in nature, repeating nonstop. These techniques didn't work when I was very acutely sick from drug withdrawal. But if you're a little bit further down the line, or maybe you have mild intrusive thoughts that just disturb you every once in a while, like I do talk to people when I'm coaching that say, oh, I suddenly have this fear of, and it's usually around hurting themselves or hurting someone else or doing something out of character or screaming in public or something like that. And something that used to help me was I would replace that fear, whatever it was I was afraid of, with something much more benign or something kind of silly, like, okay, because I always had this fear that I would have so much panic and urges that I would give in to the urges and hurt someone or hurt myself or whatever. And I hear this when I'm coaching people. So I would trade it for something benign, like bleaching my hair blonde. Well, would I ever have a panic attack so bad and urges so strong to bleach my hair that I would just go out and buy, a dye kit and dye my hair blonde just because I had this urge to do so? No, that just seems silly to me. And so I'm like, okay, well, the chances of me then doing A, B, C, whatever I'm afraid of are even less likely because that's totally out of my character and something I would never do. And if it's replaced with something that doesn't scare you, you're not going to do that either, kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense. Let me know in the comments. So that's another thing. Also, this might be an obvious one, but staying away from things that are too stimulating. So caffeine is a big one, MSG is a big one, artificial sweeteners, dyes, things in food that, are known to be neurotoxic and excitotoxic. And also, things that you watch on TV, avoid the news and watch things that are lighthearted, listen to upbeat music, don't listen to things that are too heavy. And, even though that seems maybe obvious, I think sometimes that gets overlooked and people think, well, that's so little, it's not going to make any difference for me, especially when it's chemically induced from medication. But I can tell you that in the long run, those things do help. So avoiding things that are too stimulating. This could include toxic people. So there are some people, and especially when our nervous systems are so hypersensitized, there's people, places, events, smells, songs that bring a response, like a negative response. It could be fear, it could be anger, rage, whatever. So if you can eliminate as many of those things as possible, obviously you're not going to eliminate everyone in your life, but if there's a few toxic people or just toxic things in your life or things that upset you, try to eliminate those things or just distance yourself from them as much as you can until you feel better and less of that physiological response that happens sometimes automatically when you're in withdrawal. So those are some things that helped me. And again, I realized that sometimes doing these cognitive techniques is not possible or does not make a difference when you're in withdrawal, because you are in a different chemically induced state, and I acknowledge that fully. But as I've said before, there's a lot of second fear that goes into this, and I talk to people every day about this. I was really feeling vulnerable. So I went online and I was searching things in the groups, and I went down these rabbit holes where I learned that this person has my symptom and is 8 years off and not doing any better, or nobody has this particular symptom, or I have this new symptom, or I have these changing symptoms, and you start to research, and all of those things really add to that second fear, and then you just become more and more afraid, and your world becomes smaller and smaller. This particularly happens with food. I notice a lot of people this happening too. So someone will develop, say, a sensitivity, and I'm not saying that these aren't real sensitivities, because I definitely, with processed food, I think our nervous systems are so hypersensitive, they start reacting to processed food, chemicals in them, whatever. But then people will start having reactions to other types of foods, and then they start to fear all foods. Or someone will go into a wave and they don't notice consciously anything that precipitated it, so then naturally the brain wants to attach it to something, so you'll start reviewing everything that you ate, everything you drank, everything you did. And I don't think that's a bad thing if you're looking to overall sort of clean up your health habits and stuff like that. But if you're trying to pinpoint, okay, well, I ate a piece of toast this morning with, I don't know, something in it that might have triggered it, now I can't eat toast anymore, I'm never going to be able to eat bread, and you start to really. And then that second fear builds up and it becomes this feedback loop. So then you go and have another meal and then you feel even worse and the fear gets stronger, and then you're like, oh God, now I can't eat this food. And I do think that there are sensitivities, don't get me wrong, like MCAS and histamine, I do believe play a role in this 100%. But I think if you can calm your system down by using some of these techniques, and there is, I believe, a whole limbic system component to sensitivities to food and smells, and that can be somewhat worked through. I know some people have had positive success with things like DNRS and Gupta and all of those limbic system retraining programs. I think there's an aspect to that, but again, that's like the second fear thing. And so yeah, if you can do as much as you can do to try to avoid getting into that next state of fear and creating that feedback loop, the more you can work on not having that happen, the better. But I do understand that some things, especially in acute withdrawal, are really impossible to control. And so again, active distraction is another big part of this. There's so many people that are really in a fear-induced state, and that can manifest in different ways: intrusive thoughts, panic attacks, phobias, PTSD type symptoms, DPDR. And the more you can actively distract, the better. I've made videos about this. I talk to people about this. If you're doing just passive things, like people will say, well, I'm trying to, watch a movie, or I'm trying to read, or I'm trying to do something and it's just not helping. Well, I consider that a passive distraction. Reading is a little bit less of a passive distraction because you are actively reading and processing the information. But something really passive like TV watching is not typically helpful for people, because their fear brain is so powerful that it just takes over any type of ability to distract. So the more you can engage, anything that involves engaging with people, I know that can be tough for people, but even through a screen, talking, engaging with people, interacting, if it's engaging, interacting, and involves, a higher level of brain power, the better. As much as you can do. Obviously, everybody's limitations are different, but that's another big part of helping you through the fear. So anyway, I hope this video was helpful. Let me know your feedback in the comments, and any other techniques or tips or tools that you help with, or that help you with fear or second fear or those anxiety type symptoms. I know they can be really intense, but hopefully that was helpful. Let me know how you guys are doing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.